Now today we return to the story about the establishment of the kingdom of Israel, which we have been following for months and months as we make our way through the book of 1 Samuel. It has all come down to two men. The first is King Saul, the officially anointed king of Israel, the one God picked to be Israel's first king. And the second is David, the one picked by God to become the second king of Israel. In their moments, in their lives, the moment has come. Each man must now decide for the good or evil side. The American poet James Russell Lowell said it this way: "Once to every man and nation comes the moment to decide in the strife of truth with falsehood for the good or evil side." Now, I have to just stop and I have to play for a minute here. You ready? That is one of the church's great old hymns. And I know some of you just love to sing those great old hymns. Just for my information, if you know the hymn, put to the will you just raise your hand? Be careful when you say you want to sing those great old hymns. Now, I have to tell you, I agree with everything James Russell Lowell said in those verses I read to you. I have to tell you, I don't agree with everything he ever wrote in his whole life, but I agree with those, except for one word. That is the word once. The moment to choose for the good or evil side returns again and again and again. For God is relentless in his pursuit. He knocks on every human heart time and time and time again, and each time he knocks, we must decide for the good or evil side. Yes, you heard me. I said we. We must decide. You and I must decide. For today, as we are gathered here in this place or listening from somewhere else, who knows where in the world, for today, God is relentlessly knocking on the doors of our hearts, yours and mine. And once again, as he knocks, we must decide for the good or evil side. In the story we have been reading in 1 Samuel, God has knocked on the door of King Saul's heart time and time again. And Saul has made his choice. When he consulted the witch at Endor and called up the spirit of the dead prophet Samuel, for whom the book is named, Saul had made his choice. He disregarded the guiding words of God and chose the evil side. We will see the consequences of his choice before the story told in 1 Samuel ends. But even now, God has ceased knocking on the door of Saul's heart. Though God is relentless and persistent in his seeking, there is a moment when the gate to the altar swings shut with a resounding thud to open no more. For King Saul, that moment has come, and God knocks no more. But David still hangs in the balance, and on the door of his heart, God is relentlessly knocking. David has taken shelter from Saul, his enemy, in the territory of the Philistines ruled by Achish. The Bible tells us that David moved in with Israel's enemies without consulting God. The Bible uses the word, it seemed to him to be the best way to escape Saul. And he lived there for better than a year. Achish had given David the city of Ziklag, and David had brought his family and the families of his men to that city to live. While they lived there, David and his men raided towns which belonged to the Philistines. They completely wiped out the population of those cities, the ones they raided, so that no one would know that David and his men were the ones who had destroyed them. And David lied to Achish, telling him that he was raiding Israeli towns. Remember, none of this was of God. David thought it all up by his little old self. But now, the text set before us today says that the moment of reckoning had come. God was knocking. The Philistines invaded Israel, and Achish demanded that David join him to defeat Israel. Now think about it. Israel's next king is David. And David was going out with Israel's enemies to defeat Israel, the very nation David was supposed to rule. What could be going on in David's mind? The text set before us says the Philistines gathered all their forces at Aphek, and Israel camped by the spring at Jezreel. As the Philistine rulers marched out with their units of hundreds and thousands, David and his men were marching at the rear with Achish. The commanders of the Philistines asked, "What about these Hebrews?" And Achish replied, "Is this not David, who was an officer of Saul, king of Israel? He has already been with me for over a year, and from the day he left Saul until now, I have found no favor in him, no fault in him." But the Philistine commanders were angry with Achish. They said, "Send the man back, that he may return to the place you assigned him. He must not go with us into battle, or he will turn against us during the fighting." How better could he regain his master's favor than by taking the heads of our own men? Isn't this the David they sang about in their dances? Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. How that song comes back to haunt him. David and his men were marching out with the Philistines to fight against Israel. They had been chosen as the personal bodyguard of King Achish. So they marched near the rear of the army beside the king. Note that this is the perfect place, once the battle starts, for a friend of Israel to be. All David had to do was win the battle by killing the king and attacking the Israelites or the Philistines from the rear, as the Israelite army attacked from the front. Apparently, though Achish trusted David, the commanders of his army did not, and they demanded that David and his men be sent home. The text before us says, "So Achish called David and said to him, 'As surely as the Lord lives,'" he uses the word Yahweh, "'as surely as Yahweh lives, you have been reliable, and I would be pleased to have you serve with me in the army. From the day you came to me until today, I have found no fault in you, but the rulers don't approve of you. Now turn back. Go in peace. Do nothing to displease the Philistine rulers.'" "But what have I done?" asked David. "What have you found against your servant from the day I came to you until now? Why can't I go and fight against the enemies of my lord the king?" And Achish answered, I know that you have been as pleasing in my eyes as an angel of God." Nevertheless, the Philistine commanders have said he must not go with us into battle. Now get up early along with your master's servants who have come with you, and leave in the morning as soon as it is light." So David and his men got up early in the morning to go back to the land of the Philistines, and the Philistines went up to Jezreel. So by the intervention of God, let me just repeat that. By the intervention of God, David is spared from fighting against Israel, the land he is eventually to rule, and sent home to Ziklag. David does not recognize the hand of God in this. In fact, he appears to be reluctant to go home at all. Who knows what he was thinking? Maybe he was indeed planning to stab Achish in the back and defeat Saul at last by defeating the Israel army. Who knows what he was thinking? Whatever it was that David thought is lost in David's mind, for the text does not tell us what he was thinking. But by the hand of God, the intervention of God, he is sent home to Ziklag. Lesson number 1 for today, you ready? It is always a mistake to make plans without consulting God and His Word. How do we get along in God's world, God's way, folks? Trust and obey. So David and his men turned around and started to march back to Ziklag. It was a 3-day march. David and his men reached Ziklag on the 3rd day. Now the Amalekites had raided the Negev and Ziklag. They attacked Ziklag and burned it, and had taken captive the women and everyone else in it, both young and old. They killed none of them, but carried them off as they went on their way. When David and his men reached Ziklag, they found it destroyed by fire, and their wives and sons and daughters taken captive. So David and his men wept aloud until they had no strength left to weep. David's 2 wives had been captured, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. When David and his men reached Ziklag, they found that it had been burned to the ground. Their families and all their possessions had been taken by the Amalekites. Now, for those of you who do not remember the history, the Amalekites were the descendants of Esau, the son of Isaac, the brother of Jacob, from whom Isaac had stolen, or from whom Jacob had stolen the birthright. The Amalekites had attacked Israel when Israel was leaving Egypt under Moses. And a few chapters ago, God had ordered Saul to kill them all as retaliation for their attack on Israel. But Saul had not obeyed, and now the Amalekites have attacked Ziklag and David. And now David and his men had lost all they owned to the Amalekites, including their wives and their children. It was all in Amalekite hands. All because one man, Saul, had not trusted God and had not obeyed him completely. Oh, let's just repeat it for fun. Lesson number 1, it is always a mistake to make plans without consulting God and His Word. Now, I'm going to ask you again, and I want to hear the right answer. How do you get along in God's world, God's way? Yeah, you trust and obey. Even when the circumstances are dark, even when you can't see through the cloud, even when everything is pressing in on you and it appears to be lost, trust God and obey. The text says, David was greatly distressed because the men were talking of stoning him. Each one was bitter in spirit because of his sons and daughters. But David found strength in Yahweh, his God. David was distressed. His family had been taken captive by the enemies. His men were talking about killing him. But it was in that dark moment that David found strength in the Lord. Yahweh, our relentless God, was still knocking on the door of David's heart. And in those dark circumstances, again, the moment came for David to decide for the good or evil side. And once again, praise God, David turned back to God. Lesson number 2 for today. It comes not once. The moment to choose for the good or evil side returns again and again and again. For God is relentless in his pursuit. He knocks upon the human heart time and time and time again, and each time he knocks, we must decide for the good or evil side. He is knocking on your heart and my heart today. For which side will you choose? Will you go your own way? Or will you trust and obey? The poet said once to every man and nation. Our nation stands at the same place as do each one of us today. God is knocking on the heart of the United States of America. And friends, it is time for our nation to choose for the good or evil side. If we do not choose the good side, our fate may well be worse than that of King Saul himself, about which we will read in a few weeks. But the change of the nation does not begin with the president. It does not begin with the Congress or the Supreme Court. It does not begin with the government. It begins right here, in my heart and in yours. As long as the people of this nation choose the evil side, God will give us the government we deserve, a government that chooses the evil side. But this morning, God knocks relentlessly upon our hearts, as he has knocked time and time before. And today, he's knocking on your heart and on mine. And the question remains, which side will you choose? Will you go your own way? Or will you trust and obey